Thank you very much for having me. I have to say that I'm absolutely terrified of everybody in this room, so please be gentle. As Miguel said, my job, one of my jobs is I'm the Prime Minister's ambassador to TechCity. TechCity is a small part of London which has been given over to the technology industry, and it's a role which means that I get to be the ambassador from the tech industry to the Prime Minister, and from the Prime Minister back out to the tech industry. I'm also the editor-at-large of Wired magazine. You have an Italian edition of Wired magazine. I'm the editor-at-large of the British one. And I'm also employed mostly as a futurist. Now, a futurist is somebody who is paid to live 6 months in the future, really, and come back and tell you all about it. And as you may not be aware of this, but in 5 months' time, the European Union is going to make PowerPoint illegal. So I won't be using any slides today, but I've also been told, for the camera's point of view, I'm not allowed to go any further than here. So if I'm trapped in this corner. The point of being a futurist, the point of really is to tell stories about the future. Science fiction, specifically, has never really been about the future. It's always been about the present. We use stories of future stuff to better understand the today. Because as the very famous science fiction author William Gibson once said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. It's a very famous quote to pull out about this moment in one of these sorts of talks. Nobody is ever living entirely in the present. All of us live in many different eras at the same time. We're here, in halfway between Florence and Fiesole, a city most famous for the Renaissance and a town most famous for the Romans, in a 15th century villa, talking about ultra-modern things. We all live across many different eras, and certainly none of us are ever entirely present, in both senses of the word, and we'll come to the second meaning of that in a moment. But one thing that we can say is, over the past 20 years, the internet has really radically changed the way that we all live our lives, no matter how much Chianti and panzanella we can eat over lunchtime. The digital revolution that we're living through at the moment has transformed pretty much everything that we encounter in a way which I would say is at a level with, if not more important than, the Renaissance that started down the road. And this isn't just a transformation of the really banal things, which are the usual things that I would start talking about. A transformation of the music industry, or a transformation of the travel agency industry, or a transformation of all of those sorts of consumer-type things. Actually, what's happened is that we have found ourselves subject to technological forces which are inherently transformative to society as a whole. And that's a couple of those are what I want to talk about today. I think there are two fundamental laws of technology. They're called laws, they're not really. Fundamental laws of technology which have become massively transformative to every single field, and all of the fields that you all study or work in. Let's look at the first one, Moore's Law. Does everybody here know what Moore's Law is? Social scientists, lovely, brilliant. Moore's Law is the rule of thumb that was made by Gordon Moore. He was the chief engineer and co-founder of Intel, the people who make the microchips. And in 1958, he looked at the chips that they were making, and he realized a rule of thumb, which was quite standard, which was that for the same price, the number of components on an integrated circuit would double every 12 to 18 months. And he said, that's very interesting. I wonder if that will continue. And about 1965 or so, he looked back and he realized that trend had continued, and he predicted that trend would continue. And indeed it has. Every 12 to 18 months, for the same price, computing power doubles. Now, this is a fundamental change in the way that humanity progresses. We have never before seen an exponential growth in the capability of technology over a long period of time. The reason for this is because we use computing to design the next generation of computing. And that's really the first time that's ever happened, that technology generates the next version of itself. But the implications of Moore's law are key to understanding the 21st century. They're actually very key to every single field that you're in. Let's take an example of that. I work for David Cameron, the British Prime Minister. He entered power about a year and a half ago. He had an iPhone 3GS in his pocket when he walked into Downing Street for the first time. iPhone 3GS at the time was about £400, roughly. Now, assuming he gets re-elected at the next election and becomes a two-term Prime Minister, at the end of his term in office, he'll have an iPhone 12 or something like that in his pocket. And an iPhone 12 will be about 128 times as powerful as the phone he had in his pocket when he entered office. Or, the equivalent phone, the equivalent iPhone 3GS, will cost around £4 by the time he leaves office, which means they're free with coffee. You'll get them free with your coffee in the morning at every cafe you go to. Now, that means that a technology which 2 years ago was considered to be a miracle technology will, within easily foreseeable policy, forecasting time frame, be trivially available to anybody on the planet. Which makes the Prime Minister's job, and for people like myself who advise him, very difficult. Because any policy that he has to make today, or the British government, or any government has to make today, has to still be valid in 10 or 20 years' time. And in 10 or 20 years' time, we will have classes of technologies which we today are incapable of understanding, or even imagining. And this is not just a science fiction fantasy, this is kind of extrapolating just from the present. It's a very obvious thing. This itself has very many secondary implications. The first one, for any industry, is that if they see a technological rivalry, if they see something that might one day affect them, but today it isn't very good, then it's only a matter of time until it destroys them. A good example of this is digital cameras. Polaroid, for example. Polaroid and Kodak, let's take Kodak as a good example. Kodak invented digital cameras 20 years ago. But the first digital camera that they invented was 0.1 megapixels. It was a terrible, terrible camera. And so Kodak looked at the digital camera that they had invented and said, that's terrible. And they looked at the transparency film that they were selling, Kodachrome, and they went, that's beautiful. Nobody will ever want digital cameras. We will stick with what we're doing. And 20 years later, Kodak go bankrupt. And Instagram, the same week, Instagram, a digital photography app on a phone, is valued at $1 billion. Anything that can be done today, not very well, will be perfect in a few years' time. Just through dint of Moore's law, just through the additional power and hardware coming out. This is a very difficult proposition to get across to a lot of people, especially in incumbent industries, because the change is very gradual and then very sudden. But it is almost inevitable in pretty much everything you do. The second thing that comes from this is that if you can be replaced by an algorithm, you will be. And we're starting to see this rolling across industries. If your individual expertise can be replaced by, or 90% or 95% of your individual expertise can be replaced by an algorithm, it will be. And if today you can only be replaced by an algorithm not very well, then Moore's law just says that eventually the computing power will be here to mean that it's good, or good enough. Now this is a problem for the financial markets at the moment. 90% of the equity trades in London, for example, are done by artificial intelligences and not by people. But we can easily see this in anything else which follows, 90% of which follows a logical structure. Medicine, law, for example. 90% of law is very boring, which means that 90% of it can be replaced by an algorithm. This has implications far beyond digital cameras and social networks and stuff like that. It means that you have to be really good at the abstract stuff, because the basic stuff you'll be replaced by an algorithm. You'll be replaced by a computer. Again, if today it's not very good but exists, in a few years' time it will continue to exist and be very good. Financialization, the algorithmization, if that's a word, the algorithmization of the financial industry is a very good example of this. The current economic crisis, a good deal of the problems that we find ourselves in have been caused by the algorithmization or the automation of the algorithmization of the financial markets. And this highlights a deeper problem, that just because you can throw a lot of computing power at something doesn't mean that it'll always be right. So again, it just means that when you do go wrong much harder than you previously did before. If you've got artificial intelligences running the financial markets, and those artificial intelligences go a little bit insane, then you have a very big problem. And this is what happened about a year and a half ago. There was a thing called the flash crash, or the 2:45 crash, it's also called, because it happened at 2:45 in the afternoon in the US, where the US stock markets went into freefall for about 40 seconds. They dropped, I believe the NASDAQ dropped 500 points in about 40 seconds. And the reason it happened was because the artificial intelligences that were making 90% of the trades all went insane, collectively. One started to sell a lot, the other one started to see that, and 10,000 of them suddenly all came in and thought there was a panic and all started to sell at the same time. And it was only because literally somebody somewhere, a human somewhere, hit the stop button and shut the market down, that it didn't continue. Artificial intelligences taking over things are only as good as the original programming. And when they go wrong very badly. But there's an almost inevitable thing of these AIs taking over stuff that can be replaced by algorithms. The trick really is to know what can be automated safely and what can't. And I don't believe that we as a society really are capable of making that decision quite yet. And we certainly haven't had the conversations about what's a good idea to be automated and algorithmized and what isn't. The second law that's really transforms a lot of these sorts of technologies is Metcalfes Law. Metcalfes Law says that the value of a network is equal to the number of nodes on that network squared. Now what that means is that the more people you have in the network, the value of that network exponentially grows again. This has created a very interesting social situation over the past 10 years or so, in that we seem to be going away from, generally across society, away from hierarchies and over to networks. Now think about the way that European society was structured pre-1989. Pre-1989, you had the Cold War, and European society was almost Freudian. You had huge amounts of pyramidal structures within society, father figures at the top, and everybody underneath. Chancellors at the top, professors at the top, everybody underneath. And you would enter the hierarchy at the bottom, work your way up, get a gold watch at the end, retire, die of relief a few years later. No matter whatever position or society or corporation structure or institution you were in, they were hierarchical. And society itself was hierarchical and very simple, very easy, bipolar, east versus west, and so on. Very easy to understand. Post-1989, however, a couple of things happened. Berlin Wall falls, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Europe, and in 1990, 6 weeks after the reunification of Germany, 1990, the first web server is turned on, a couple hundred miles to the south. And since 1990, we have seen both a slow disintegration of the hierarchical structure of society, but also an increasing strengthening of networks brought about by technologies. Everybody here is part of a major social network that is geographically independent. Whether you're on Facebook, you're on Twitter, or you're part of your intellectual, academic research networks, your networks are stronger than the hierarchies that are represented in the building. Now, for everybody in this room who are all of a certain age, this is only halfway there. But what we're starting to see in society across Europe is that the kids don't see the hierarchies at all. And this is a very specific thing that's happening in countries where the demographics are very heavily skewed towards teenagers and young people. I was in Brazil earlier this year speaking to the top Lacanian therapist in Brazil. Very, very great man. He was the personal therapist to Lula. And he said, very interestingly to me at least, that whereas 20 years ago the majority of his clients would have been 21-year-olds who couldn't relate to their parents, today the vast majority of his clients are 65-year-olds who can't relate to their kids. Because their kids don't want to enter the hierarchy. They don't want to go and get the management trainee job and work their way up. They don't want to enter academia and work their way up. They want to go and start their own thing and work sideways with their friends. Tap into their networks rather than enter a hierarchy. And this subtle change in the way that society comes about, I would say, comes from the fundamental qualities that the internet brings. The fundamental qualities that the web brings. Take this as an example. 15 years ago, if you went to a restaurant and you had a really good meal, you would be able to tell your friends, and that would be it. And if you wanted to be a restaurant critic, then you would have to work your way up through some hierarchy in a newspaper and eventually become the one restaurant critic in your town, or the one of the 5 restaurant critics in your country. Today, however, there literally isn't anything that we can do in life that we can't review in public somewhere on the web. Every book you read, every film you see, every restaurant you go to, every hotel you go to, every flight you take, every professor you listen to, everybody, every doctor you see. There isn't anywhere on the world, in anything you can do in the world that you can't rate somewhere and do it publicly. And this shift in being able to review stuff has taught a whole generation, if not 2 generations, of people a whole new set of values and beliefs and understandings of the way that society works. Because my ability to rate and review in public any book I read or every film I see, radically changes the way that I interact with, say, my elected politicians. We talk about a democracy deficit or a lack of interest in democracy in Western Europe. I would say actually it's completely the opposite. We're incredibly interested in democracy. It's just that there's no input in the way that there's an input in our ability to rate everything else in our lives. Customer service, for example, is now incredibly attuned to social networks. If you complain about something on Twitter, at least the vast majority of the big consumer brands will come back to you very, very quickly and try and fix the problem. We kind of expect that to happen. If you get on a plane, you have bad service from the airline. When you get off the plane, you tweet about the airline. Almost undoubtedly, that airline will come back to you very quickly and apologize. Because through that, you start to see yourself as a first-class individual. Not in a hierarchy, but in a network of equals. But if you start complaining about a politician or a political system on Twitter, do you get replies from the Prime Minister? No, of course not. And it's a subtle shift of expectation that has been happening over the past 10 years, which changes the way that we see hierarchical systems against network systems. This is it might strike you as a very banal, slightly trivializing example. But actually, if you're used to, as a young person specifically, if you're used to having your opinion taken seriously in everything you do, if only by your peers, when you then face up to a situation where your opinion matters not at all, there comes a pushback against it. And that is a very dangerous situation for modern democracies to be in. Because as we know from all theories of revolution, revolutions come not when there's a big problem, but when the rate of change is not as high as the expected rate of change. And we're used to, in many parts of our lives, through the internet, a higher rate of change than we're getting from democratic institutions. Another major trend that we're starting to see is culture is embedding itself in technology. And this is potentially a threat or potentially a problem. Over the next couple of years, you're going to start hearing one phrase very, very often. Thank you. The phrase smart cities. Smart cities, for those of you who don't know, is where you take very small, very cheap devices that can measure something and place them all the way across your city. Whether it's measuring air quality or ambient noise levels, or where it's measuring where the buses are or where the trains are, or how many people are walking down the pavement. Whatever it is. It measures something small, measures something very simply, and it sends that information over the internet into the cloud. And the idea is that then the citizens of that place will be able to monitor that data using a phone, usually, and make individual decisions based on that live data. So if you know, for example, that the buses are full of people, then you will change your travel plans. If you decide on a Friday evening that you want to go somewhere that's loud and boisterous, you will look and you'll see you'll see a map of the city and you'll see where all of the people are, and you will go there. Or you'll decide you want a quiet evening out, you will go where they're not. And so on and so on. And these smart city projects are popping up all over the place. You even have them in Florence for a couple of years now with knowing where the buses are, with live data from the buses. Now, these smart city projects are really the next big thing, because all of the major technology vendors are throwing all of their money into it. IBM, Cisco, and so on. They see it as the next place they can make cash. And this is going to have a fundamental effect on the way that our cities operate. The reason for this is because the technology changes what the technology counts. What I mean by that is, whenever you put a number on the wall, that number will go up, or go in the direction you want it to go. When you pay attention to a particular metric, that particular metric will travel in a particular direction. And so it's very, very, very important that smart city projects measure the correct thing and are optimized for the thing that you want to optimize your city for. Now, at the moment, the majority of smart city projects are made by American tech firms, and the thing that they want to optimize cities for are people driving from the suburbs into the center of the town and going and working in a cubicle and then driving back again. And this software which is optimized for transit time, is being sold to cities all the way around Europe. But many cities around Europe don't want to optimize themselves for transit time to and from a cubicle in an office building. Many cities around Europe want to optimize themselves for sitting in cafes and drinking coffee, or watching pretty girls on bicycles go by, or going to art galleries, or they want to optimize themselves for love, or inspiration, or beauty, or whatever it is. And what we're starting to find is that the cultural values of the companies that are making the technology are becoming part of the city in which that technology is being implanted. Again, in a very curious, anti-democratic way. I was in Denmark a couple of months ago, in Aarhus, which is the second city of Denmark, and or who's very, very proud of the fact that they have the most number of pavement cafes per capita in any other city in Northern Europe. They're really into pavement cafes. But they've installed smart city software, which is, again, tuned for people driving from the suburbs to the office block and back out again. And they're very worried that the technology they're using to optimize their city has an inherent cultural value which is not the cultural value that they want to promote in their town. And as these technological laws, Moore's Law and Metcalfes Law, push forward, and as people are more and more embodied in their technology, there is a great concern that we are allowing ourselves to be steered in a way which is contrary to the way we want to build our societies. Now, these three things, the inevitable increase in the capability of technology, the inevitable power of the network over the hierarchy, and the cultural embodiment of the values of technology fighting against our personal values, really come to a head, come to a very intimate place with the devices that probably all of you have in your pocket or sat in front of you. It turns out that we are very, very, very happy with this technology because we all have one of these. And these are incredibly intimate devices. I would make a suggestion that there isn't anybody in this room who knows more than 3 phone numbers off the top of their head. You probably know your own phone number, you probably know the phone number of your lover, and you probably know the phone number you had when you were 12 years old. But you don't remember any other phone numbers. And why would you? Because you all have a part of your brain outsourced to this device. I can tell you this because if I come over and take one of your phones off your desk, you would freak out. Because it would be like me, putting my hand inside your shirt. It would be an incredibly intimate thing for me to do. These devices, the physical reification of the internet, have become deeply embedded in our psyche. Let me give you an example of this. Or a couple of examples that many of you might be able to appreciate, and some of you will learn to appreciate over the next few years as you use them more. There seems to be a trend that after a while, when you're using digital communications tools for a long time, they affect the way you think. So, as an example, many of you here, I don't know what it works in any other languages you might speak, but in English we talk about having 5 senses. Right? And there's the 6th sense, which is that Bruce Willis is dead, and then the 7th and 8th and 9th senses are all different things. There's the physical sense of hunger, for example. There's the sense of thirst. There's the sense of how tired you are. There's the sense of how much you need to go to the bathroom. All these other physical senses. Now, many of you right now will have a physical sensation of how many unread messages you have in your inbox. It's a sign that these sorts of technologies are changing the way that you think. They're changing your bodies, genuinely changing your bodies. Brain plasticity and all of that, changing the way that you think about things. Some of you as well will have a general physical sensation about the psychological well-being of all of your friends, no matter where they are on the planet. Because if you follow your friends on Facebook or on Twitter, for example, then you learn subconsciously the patterns with which they speak, or the frequency with which they post to Twitter, or the frequency with which they send you an email, or the language they use when they're using Facebook. And after a while, if that language changes a little bit, you start to think, well, it's really weird. I haven't heard from Miguel for a long time. I wonder if he's okay. And you have a constant partial awareness of the psychological state of your friends. This is all the more the case if you have Skype or instant messaging on your desktops. Because if you do, Skype especially, you see people logging in and logging out. So you're sat here, you get to work, an hour later you see people in London come alive, and at your lunchtime you see people in New York wake up, and then when you're about to go for a Negroni, you see all the people in San Francisco wake up, and you see people coming and going in their general rhythm of their day. And what we're seeing is that people are developing a continuous partial awareness of the rest of the world, or at least their friends within it. We also find that it changes the way we learn and think. Over the past 20 years or so, we've gone from learning facts to learning pathways. Now, as academics, this has always been the case, but for the vast majority of the world, you would go to school and you would learn facts, and then you would leave school and you would forget those facts, and everybody would be happy. Now we don't learn facts, we learn pathways. We don't learn what something is, we learn how to find out something. That's perfectly normal, it's perfectly sensible, it's perfectly fine. You don't want to learn who starred in every film you've ever seen because you could always look it up on IMDb on your phone. It's all good, right? The loss of facts and the growth of pathways changes the way that we interpret the world. And this comes about as a natural consequence of having technology in your pocket and these fundamental laws push forward. Now, the reason for going through all of these things is that we are now entering not really the, to use the Churchillian phrase, this is not the end, this is not even the beginning of the end, this is the end of the beginning of the technological revolution. As we now enter the third decade of the internet, the time when it's not particularly, the fact that we have the internet is not interesting anymore, and that we're all starting to use it for everything that we do in our lives. It's very incumbent upon us, both as people like myself as a technologist, but also everybody else in every other field of human society. It's incumbent upon us to pay attention to the social effects of these technologies which we have embraced so tightly. And to pay attention and be mindful of the effects of these fundamental forces. If this technology touches us in every place that we can be touched, and that technology itself is growing at an exponential rate, then it is incumbent upon us, no matter what field we're in, to understand that exponentiality, to understand what it does to everything that we do in our lives. My next research project is based on what technology does to mindfulness, what it does to our ability to concentrate. The fact that many of you walking down the street will think that your phone is vibrating in your pocket, even when it isn't, because you've given 10% of your brain to constantly thinking about your phone. And what does that do to the way that we can operate? But many other people are studying many other things. Marshall McLuhan said that first we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. And it's time now for it not just to be technologists to shape internet tools, but for everybody else, for lawyers and politicians and all other fields, to start to push back and to shape the way that we build the technological future. Because if we don't, it's going to be me in charge, and nobody wants that. Thank you very much.